Hi, everybody. My name is Fanil Patel. I am a software engineer at tCrill. With me is Jenna Mikowski. Sorry, Jenna Mikowski. I like to gesture, but I have a mic. Jenna Mikowski, who is the head of product at tCrill, and we are going to be talking to you about rethinking open edX documentation today. So this is what our agenda looks like. We'll talk about so we've been doing a bit of work in this area to try to understand what's going on and to sort of think about how we can improve our documentation. We'll go through what the problems are today, the approach we took to get a better understanding of the sort of state of the world as it is, and a proposal for what we think we should do next as a community, and then a small demo of sort of what that could look like. So with that, I'll introduce the team. So Jenna and I here. Mark Hober was unable to make it. He's still alive. He's fine, but he was unable to join us here in Lisbon. And the three of us have been working together on this for a little while to do a bunch of different things to understand the current state of the system and to produce some experiments. And with that, I will give it to Jenna to talk to you about the problems that we were facing today.
Thanks, Neil. I'm impressed. It's the last session of the day. Everyone's exhausted. Thank you for coming. Yeah, so we wanted to start out this project from sort of a discovery mindset, right? So when I joined in December, this was one of the first things that kind of came up, I think, within the team as being identified as sort of a potential problem. And I think just from hearing conversations overheard in the last 3 days, it sounds like the documentation has been sort of a pain point for a while. And so we wanted to take a discovery approach to this and really take some time to understand. So if you think about, again, that double diamond framework, you start with what you sense is a problem. You have a hunch that there's some sort of problem, but then you want to focus some work on really defining what that problem is and understanding the nuance of the problem. And so that's the approach that we took with this. And so what was driving some of the hunch, some of our hunches that there's a problem. These are just things that we're sort of like hearing, right? I just need to, I need a quick answer. Like, how do I randomize assessments? Like, I know there's documentation to do this, but how do I find it? I can't find it easily. How do I contribute? That's like a basic question. Like, what's the onboarding process to contribute to the project? From faculty members or course authors, I don't like the read the docs for how to build an open edX course. Scrolling through just the index, it's like 26 pages. I don't have time to scroll through this to find what I need to build a course. I just want a quick start guide or something to do that. Updating, like this page hasn't been updated in 4 years. Is this a problem? I don't know. Is this recent? Where's the README for this repo? This one is like the most painful one to me, is like from the instructional perspective. Multiple choice and true and false is all I can do, right? There's all this rich assessment capacity, but no templates, no documentation to easily make that accessible to average users. And so this is sort of the landscape of the problem as we started to look at how it was being defined by users and within the community. So our approach to doing this sort of discovery work was to structure it around sort of two of the W questions, right? Who are the documents at Open edX for? And then what problems are they trying to solve and for whom? And we figured if we could sort of crack or have a better understanding of the answers to these questions, and again, there's like never a single answer, but the answers to these questions, then we could make some decisions we could use the answers to these questions to drive decisions about how should the documents be organized, and also what kinds of documentations we need for these problems to be solved. So this is the sort of framework that we used for structuring the problem. So Fanil mentioned that there were 3 sort of approaches that we took to undertaking this discovery work. The first approach was to try and do some persona profiling work or some persona research. And so we structured this around kind of like a typical persona research project where the goal is to create an understanding of the needs and pain points of open edX users, obviously to inform the process. And the outcome are something that are called day in the life profiles. So the idea is that you kind of develop a fictitious profile for a type of user, but it's grounded in interviews or it's grounded in like personal experience because you are that user, you've been working with these types of users for a decade. And so you build a profile for them that helps you to illustrate what the pain points and the challenges are from a user perspective. And so we started on this sort of profile project. I think this is a project that has the potential to expand a lot further. We've only looked at a couple of types of personas. And I think this would actually be a great sort of project to throw out with the community, and we can sort of build this persona directory together. But for this particular project as a starting point, we sort of started on the educator side just to kind of build out a template for it. So we talked to 2 instructional design subject matter experts, 2 higher ed educators, 3 program directors, and then also just synthesized like a decade's worth of Finial-driven developer research for the developer angle. And we asked questions like, what part of the Open edX workflow is central to your daily tasks? Or what is the most challenging part of the Open edX workflow for you? Or how is the success of your job measured? And the results of these profiles, so again, these are all fictitious, right? But kind of grounded in these interviews and these conversations. So just as an example, Penelope Wu is a lead instructional designer at a fictitious university, a big state university in New York. And most importantly, her relationship to Open edX is that she's like an in-the-weeds user, right? She works for a digital learning center at the university. She designs all of the continuing adult education programs. So the university uses Open edX for continuing adult education. And so she works directly with faculty as the subject matter experts to translate their subject expertise into an online course. So she's not the subject matter expert, she's the designer. The fun thing about persona profiles is that you want kind of a holistic understanding of this person and where they're coming from. Right? So not just about their challenge, but it's about what drives them, what's their motivation. And so her interests are in pedagogical theory. This is where she is an expert. This is her passion. Her goals, is over here. Her goals are completion rates and high certificate conversion rates, right? So this is a revenue driver for the university. So she's kind of on the hook for those completion rates, which will in turn drive revenue. She needs to train her teams to become proficient users of Open edX. So she's got staff that she's responsible for. And she also has to train the subject matter expert faculty who are not always pedagogical experts, right? They're experts in whatever they teach, climate change, but they're not experts in pedagogy. And just having this, like, speaking from experience of having this role myself prior, like lots of faculty I think are often in this space. They can talk days on end about their subject, but when it comes to actually teaching it well online, there's a gap there. She's motivated by conversion rates for the center, and she loves to hear success stories. So she's really invested in the end user. And she has a lot of challenges, right? So she often hits customization walls that require some HTML skills that she doesn't have. She's not a coder by trade. She's not technical. So she has to learn kind of HTML on her own, which is overwhelming. She's responsible for training staff, and most of them are also non-technical. So that's another barrier for her. And then again, she works with these faculty who are subject matter experts, but not pedagogy experts. And so that's another gap she has to fill. So she needs resourcing to help her there. And so what are some things that she needs or expects? Maybe some customization options, things like some sort of like techless LTI point and click app, things to remove that HTML barrier. How-to guides that make it easy for some non-staff to put a course together. Access to better resources for training. So there's one example. I've never run through this to time it, so I have no idea. Okay. So I won't go through all of these word for word because these slides will be available. We can start to get the picture here, right? So here's the director of that program. He's the one who made the decision to use Open edX, but has no prior, no other deep knowledge of it. But for him, his need and his challenge is that he has to grow this program, which means he needs more faculty on board to use the platform. And now they have to learn 2 LMS systems because their campus uses Campus. Now they have to use Open edX if they want to contribute to the continuing adult education program. So he's motivated, or what he needs are, again, training materials. Another quick one, here's a faculty member who's like the evangelist for Open edX, right? So he has found the platform, he knows how to customize it, he uses it to create assessments, to teach his linear algebra courses. He actually displaced use of his textbook in the course because he can just use Open edX, doesn't need workbooks anymore. but the need for him is like he has this propensity toward OpenEdX because he's a Python programmer, so he understands how to use it. But what he would love to have, he wants to like contribute his assessment templates back to the community, but he doesn't have a way to do that. So he could actually help train other faculty to use the platform, but he doesn't have a mechanism to do that. So what this starts to look like, and I just wanted to sort of demonstrate how we started to synthesize some of this insight to guide some decisions about what we might want to do with the documentation, right? So we need short, quick fix how-to guides for non-tech users. We need some best practice references for subject matter experts who aren't pedagogical experts. We need templates that inspire, that can be reused. We need some end-to-end trainings, but they have to be bite-sized and quick, right? We need structured developer references, just as a couple of examples.
Thank you. I'll take it from here. And so on top of all of that work, talking to all those people, synthesizing all of that information and getting a lay of the land of sort of what the needs are for different people. And, you know, from my perspective, I've been hearing sort of a series of developer complaints over, as Jenna said, like 10 years, and we've been sort of recording them, taking new input from today and synthesizing that all together. That was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was we did an audit of our existing documentation. You guys know we have a bunch of documentation right now. It's in fact everywhere. So that makes it so that you always have some, right? We have some documentation, read the docs, we have it in GitHub, we have it on the Confluence wiki. Oh, that one page is locked though, and it's linked to that other one that's open, and that third one over there is locked, but I think I can open it if you give me 3 days. I'll get back to you next week, I promise. So it's hard to actually get the information you need, right? It's there, but it's hard to explore, it's hard to search through because we don't know where to start looking. The main types of documentation we have now is we have a lot of explainers, we have a lot of reference, we have a lot of places where the person who wrote the code wrote the documentation for the end user, which is, you can imagine, extremely detailed and also mostly useless to the end user. Because knowing how you implemented a thing and how the inner workings of a thing are does not help you use the thing every time. It certainly helps you use it deeply, but it doesn't get you through that door the first time when you're like, how do I use this advanced assessment? It's really cool that you're using machine learning and you've got this machine learning algorithm that you like have implemented in here, but I just need to get it on my course today. Those two things are not separated, so separating those things is really important and helpful. We have ADRs that explain specific things that are in the repos. We have OEPs that explain specific things that are not in any of the repos. How are they related? Where do they go? There's a lot of different questions. So this helped us figure out, like, okay, we have docs here, 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 here. Okay, how many of these things are RST? Great. How many of the RST things are actually getting published somewhere so that you can see the rendered version of it so it's easy for humans to read? Okay, not as many of them. Some of them have docs, some of them have the docs. They look on GitHub, they look on read the docs. Where do we go? Right? There's a lot of confusion there. The other thing we looked at is lots of places write documentation. There's a lot of places on the internet where there are good docs. So looking at what the sort of field looks like is one of, and what people outside of the OpenEdX community are doing is a thing we sort of spent some time doing. How are other companies doing it? How are other communities and open source communities doing it? How are we doing it? Are there common patterns that we can apply? Or is there a theory of documentation that we could be using? Has somebody thought deeply about this and wrote a PhD paper on it, and we can maybe learn some things about this? So we took a look at the research. Of that, we look at a bunch of different things. We looked at Moodle, which is one of our competitors in the field. We looked at the Season of Docs, which is a Google-funded project where they fund improving documentation for open source projects. So it's like, okay, how are they measuring improvements to open source documentation? What do we look at when we think about making our docs better? What are the ways that other open source projects thinking about documentation? What do they set as metrics for improvement? We looked at GitHub. We all use GitHub. I personally love the GitHub documentation. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's easy to find the things you need, it's well organized, the references are useful. Django, the thing that we built our platform on top of, amazing documentation, really well laid out. You can find the things you need for when you need them. You can be a newcomer or you can be an expert and you can be in the right place. Some of these things have a thing in common, and that is this. This is a pattern, a framework that was published by a company called Divio. It's a 4-quadrant layout of how to think about documentation. As we learned about what the needs of people were, we also learned about this pattern. We tried to think about, would this pattern work for us? And this one is one I'm pretty excited about. So there's 4 quadrants here. There's the way that it's oriented around sort of what's useful for people when they're learning versus what's useful for people when they know what they're doing, but they need to like look up, oh, what is that argument for that thing again? And then also sort of like, are they really just trying to get a thing done, or are they really trying to understand a thing because there's a bug and they need to know how like the system actually works? And so that using those 2 axes, they lay out the documentation and sort of suggest these 4 different kinds of documentation. And giving these names is, I think, really helpful for us as a community, because that lets us actually sort of start thinking about, like, okay, you want to tell somebody about an X block. What do you want to tell them? Do you want to give them a quick start so that they can run your X block? Do you want to give them a how-to so that they can mess with the advanced settings of your X block? Do you want to explain sort of the pedagogical reasons why you built the X block and what the use is for it? Or do you just want to give people the set of arguments that they need to know about to configure your X block, right? So quick starts, how-to guides, explanations, or reference. All of these are really useful pieces of information. If you shove them all into the same document, nobody's going to find it useful. So thinking about these as separate pieces and thinking about these as things that we can sort of target is sort of a thing that I think we're really excited about. We've tried to apply this pattern a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and you can sort of see what that looks like. The summary of our findings is that, there were a lot of obvious don'ts. Don't conflate document types. Don't conflate your user personas. If you're trying to help an educator build a course, don't tell them about the system settings that they need in order to enable the thing. They don't care. They don't even know how to use that. Tell them what they need to know, and perhaps tell them, hey, there is a system setting related to this. You should tell your system administrator or your operator persona to go do that. And here's the link you can give them to tell them how to turn on this thing. And then there's a how-to for an operator to go turn on a setting and how to do that, right? Those are 2 separate pieces of documentation based on 2 people doing different kinds of work. We also, we want to not overwhelm our readers. 23 pages on us, like, it's great for using Find, but it's hard to browse. It's hard to know that you're done. It's hard to like actually find the pieces. Like, okay, you're gonna go to this page. Yeah, it definitely has some anchors, but I don't know which one. So you're gonna scroll about halfway, and then if you search for this keyword, you definitely find it. It's just overwhelming, right? And in formats that are not web, don't work very well. The things we did see is, you can create simple pathways, simple ways for people to do specific tasks. That's a lot of what people needed. I think one of the assumptions that our current documentation makes a lot is that everybody wants to know all of the details about this thing you made, right? And that's not true. And like, people do want to know it. People do need to know it to become expert in this thing. But on day one, that's too much information. On day one, they just need to know, how do I get, oh, I just logged into Studio. Can I publish can I get a course that I can go share with my friend? Can I get like a single problem or a video in it? How do I get from the beginning to the end, right? Like a published course in 10 steps. That document does not exist right now in our ecosystem. There is no single document I can be like, oh, you want to just you want to build a course and publish it. Here's like a thing you can do to see it today. That document does not exist. The how to contribute document that Jenna mentioned earlier, that does exist. 4 versions of it exists in 4 different places. So trying to understand sort of what's out there and what we can do better, create simpler, clearer things, make quick hit entry points where people can just go and do the things they need to do and get out, right? People don't want to live in the documentation necessarily unless they are actually trying to go learn. And when they need to do a thing, that is not the time to try to teach them the thing. And we want to orient around common pain points. So understanding and continuing down this persona path and moving towards a more sort of like clear understanding of what the needs are of the different users. The persona work, I think, is really powerful. I think we can apply it here. I think we'll be able to apply it to a lot of other places. But, a question came up on the first day of the keynote that I think really applies here, which is like somebody asked a question and Ed asked, which users do you mean? And a thing we haven't done is name our different kinds of users yet. Like, we know there's operators, we know there's learners, we know there are educators, but sometimes there's also pedagogical experts. And do they count as educators? Do they count as, is that a new thing? And sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. There are people who support educators, people who operate the course who aren't necessarily the educator. They're just there to make sure the course is running smoothly. And these jobs exist, and each company has a different name for them, but we as a community don't have names for them. And that means we can't talk about it together and we can't sort of coalesce around what we need to help them. And even to understand what their problems are. So with that, I'm gonna hand it back to Jenna to talk about what we think we should do about it.
So our proposal is sort of grounded in everything that we just went through. And this is it. So we think that there should be a root index for all of the documentation that is organized by persona. And each of those documentation, so like for each persona, there is a quadrant with each of those 4 documentation types. And so this is kind of it conceptually. But I need to walk over here anyway. So we actually built kind of a beta of this to test what it would look like. So here's a little show and tell of that. Hopefully. Okay, cool. So the idea is that every persona would have a very clear entry point in this model. But even before that point, right here, you come to the site and immediately I'd self-identify and know where to go based on your own role. And again, this is just like, Neil said, we have a ton of work to do to identify, even the range of personas, but we think this is kind of a starting point. Quick start guides for each of these personas. So as a course author, if I just have to build a course, put a module together with units and subunits, I can go do that in this like 10-minute read quick start guide with pictures. What's new section, right? We're always trying to push upgrades, right? If we can advertise and just, demonstrate value for what comes in each upgrade in a very quick and like visual way, we can compile all of that. And then for each persona, we're using the quadrant approach, right? Quick start guides for their common pain point, right? An educator or course author has to build a course. So what's the quick start guide for that? How-tos, again, like quick hits. How do I upload a video? Or how do I randomize my assessments? And then for people who need to dive or want to dive further, the quadrant approach has a space for that. So with concepts and with references. So if you want to dig into the conceptual framework for why you like randomized assessments, you could go there.
Yeah, so I mean, to add on to that, right? Like, so here's an example for like developers. If you want to know about how an architectural overview of our platform, how many people here wishes they had one of those that they could start and give their new engineers? Yeah, and there isn't one right now. There are, again, 5 that are kind of, sort of do the thing, but like, where do you go? Which one do you trust? How do you know what the right thing is? This is meant to help alleviate that. That said, that page is empty right now. This doesn't solve the problem of us needing to build that documentation, but it's meant to solve the problem of where do I find the right one, the one of that documentation. So having that root sort of helps build that.
And so to give an example of, I think it's educator's home, maybe. Yeah. So just a quick sense of like what the educator page could look like. What are some of the most common how-tos that educators or course author, and this is where it gets a little tricky because like you have conflation. You need some conflation sometimes of personas, right? Because there's a lot of personas that just need to put a course together. So this is something to kind of think about. But we know for all of those use cases, there's like a quick start guide that could probably solve that problem, or a list of how-tos that could solve that problem. So it's about identifying what the most common ones are, right? How do you create a section? How do you add a video? Same thing for a quick start guide. But when it comes to the concepts, right, this is where we have the opportunity to really dive into like pedagogical best practice documentation with references and conceptual docs. Like how do you create an effective learning object, right? And this is something that an instructional designer, well, they probably already know this, but this is something that they could pass on perhaps or use to teach their staff or to teach the subject matter experts. How do you integrate backwards design into your course, and why is that important? But again, that doesn't need to be conflated with like how you put the course together, right? Those are two very separate pathways. Same thing for common references. I think just having templates of complex problem types to demonstrate the robustness of assessment types that you can put together if you have a little bit of a guidance to do so. So that's kind of an example, I guess, of what it looks like on the educator side.
And so, you'll notice like Jenna's talking a lot about sort of the educator side, the learner side, sort of the more end user of our platform product. And I'm talking more about the developers and some of these other things. The cool thing is we're talking about these two very different kinds of groups. We can apply this same concept to both of them, and you guys don't have to know of two different ways to navigate this system. And everybody can use this same underlying concept to lay out things. We can go recursive here, right? Like an educator, there might be under developers, front-end developers, back-end developers, and there might be all these other ways of thinking about a developer that is more nuanced. Same with operators. And we can think about like, when is there's certainly evolution here to be had of like, when is the right time to think about like splitting this one persona into two, and maybe this belongs here and here, and thinking about how we can best make the layout work for the people that are currently trying to use it. But having it all in one place, I think, is really powerful. And it's a thing that sort of docs.edx.org wasn't ever really providing. And we think that this docs.openedx.org future is sort of a much clearer way of doing that. I can talk a little bit more. So on the codings, on the developer side, there's another question, which I think is like, well, Finial, there's over 200 repositories. Do we put all of the docs for all of those repositories in one place? I thought we want to keep the documentation close to the code so that when you're writing the code, you can find it. How do we reconcile these things, right? And this is where I think what we need is to think about this, especially on the developer side, more of as a route. Like, if I could go to one place and find read the docs for the reference documentation for all of the libraries in the Open edX ecosystem. I can't, I'm not going to load all of the exact data in one page, but like, I know that it's like, oh, there's a toggles library. What does that do? Oh, there's an events library. What does that actually do? Oh, okay, this is the how-tos for how to add events. Oh, this is how I add this plugin into my system. That's a really nice how-to. Oh, this is how I start using that event and consuming that event. Really cool. And so this is sort of an extremely initial thought on this, because we've been spending a lot of time getting to where we are in the proposal, but sort of very early thoughts on how we do this for repositories is we push the same things down, but we adapt it for the things we already have. Architectural decision records is a thing that most of the engineering teams in the community have been following. We have decisions, we keep that where it is, but we have concept documentations. We have an overview, and maybe it's common that all code repos have an overview. What does this repository do today? How is it laid out? What is the architecture of this particular piece of the puzzle? We have repo-specific concept docs. It's like, okay, what do we mean when we say toggle? What does that mean in this specific context? We have quick starts for how to get people started, how-tos, and then the references. We actually take all of these doc strings that you are required to put in there because of our style checks, and we actually put them somewhere that you can find and search and read. And you don't need an IDE or a full development environment to find it. People that aren't even fully expert in development could go look for it and understand what's going on. And even if they don't know how to apply it, it still gives people the access to the information in a way that's accessible to a wider audience. So with that, I think the next steps is what we need from you guys, right? I would love to hear feedback. We have posted this. There's a much more detailed proposal on the Confluence Wiki, which is public, I made sure. And we would love for you to let us know what you think. There's a link to the info and a survey for feedback. These slides will go out later and we'll post it. But if you look in the discourse forum, there's already a proposal for the documentation. This information is there. If you're not on discourse, it's how we are going to push more and more of the community to communicate important things. So if you care about what is going on in this community, that is where that information is going to live. And as events happen. And if you want to help, right? This was a great skeleton. What didn't you see? You didn't see a lot of like, here's the exact documentation for an exact thing. It exists. We have it in a myriad of places. You all know it. It's in people's head. We need to do the work of actually putting it down and figuring it out. And what we're thinking about doing is helping build out what the needs are and then working with the community. So does that mean there's a working group around documentation that we maybe build out that is not in charge of writing all the documentation, because there's no 1 or 2 or 5 people that can do that. But that helps us figure out what documentation do we need. Probably we'll need different kinds of documentation for different people, and we need different expertise for different areas and different personas. So there's a lot to figure out. Is there a single working group? Are there different ways of contributing? Who is maintaining this? Because it is easy to write a piece of documentation once. That is the easiest part of documentation. But guess what? We've done that. We've done that for years and years. We've done that for nearly 10 years. And some of that documentation is still alive, completely wrong, and still the only published reference to a particular concept. So keeping the documentation up to date and becoming more rigorous about understanding and going through our documentation regularly is a part of the community work we need to do. And we need all of your help to do it. So that is sort of here's an idea. We need your help to make it a reality. If you think it is a good idea, please talk to us. If you think you can help, please talk to us. If you want to just help on the small piece of it that is related to the work that you're already doing, that's great. Because if everybody does a little bit of that, we'll have documented everything that is actively being developed. And wouldn't that be amazing? So with that, I wanted to say thank you, and we're ready for some questions. Kara, you want to go first and then behind? I'll repeat it. So the first question is about the process for actually making updates to the documentation. If it's in GitHub and we're making updates there, is there a PR process? What do we do with that? For that, it's actually a thing we've been talking about a lot recently. It's unclear. Not everybody is expert in GitHub. And I think that expecting everybody to get there maybe is difficult, but also maybe that's the work we need to do to get it all in a consistent place. For the review process, I think there will always be review. It may not be as formal as sort of review for a piece of code that might break the system, but reviews to say like, hey, this is right because I also know this system, or this at least looks good and your sentences are legible and you didn't have extra punctuation all over the place, or it's just not useful. It's like, you can't just make a PR for lorem ipsum and call it documentation, right? But I think that is really up to us to figure out sort of what that process looks like. We do review, like I think for anything that is a pull request, we do reviews. I think for anything that's documentation on the wiki, I think sort of building that same culture of getting more than one pair of eyes on things, right? Like open source, the more eyes we have on a thing, the better it's going to get. So thinking of that sort of cultural mentality, and then we can apply it to wherever we need to. And your second question was about sort of whether this is specific to Open edX or whether this is more broadly applicable. And my answer to that is Yes, right. This is specific to Open edX in that, and it's specific to Open edX in that this is a proposal. This is an idea. This is not like, I do not have the power to make this a reality on my own. If you guys don't like it, it probably won't happen. And if there's not enough traction, there's not enough commitment to it, it won't happen. I want to commit a lot of my resources to it, but I know that even that is not sufficient. With that said, the idea is, I think, a really good idea. I think the research we've done was sufficiently general that this could be applied to other stuff, right? Like the Divio documentation sort of thought process, that has existed for a long time. Django, in fact, uses that layout. And that's one of the reasons, like, if you look at the examples on there, on the actual, like, 12-page detailed guide on how to write good documentation, which is also good documentation and worth a read. It walks through sort of like the various projects that are using this, and you go to their sites and you're like, oh, now that I know the concept, I can navigate this even though I know nothing about this project. Like, I know what I need to do. I'm new. That means I need to either go to tutorials or quick starts or concepts, right? Like, do I learn by doing, or do I learn by just like reading and deep diving into a thing and then trying to do a thing with it? And so you can kind of navigate yourself to where you want to go, even if you know nothing about a system. So I think it's certainly a thing that I would say more places could use, and 2U and edX could use as well. But I can't affect that, even less so than I could affect the rest of the Open edX community. So any other there? We had more questions behind, yeah. Yeah. So the core of the question, I think, is sort of based on the audits we've done and all the information we have. Is that information that we'll make public? Yeah, I think that's information that we would be happy to make public, and it would be easy enough to do, and we can post that to Discourse as a follow-up to our existing post and link to that audit spreadsheet. I think it is already public, but it may not be easy to find. So we'll make it easier to find. Once this site is actually an official site, we'll maybe put it on the site as a, why are we doing this? The question was, did I find in the work something that explains the Django admin panel? Django actually has some amazing documentation about the Django admin panel, about how to use it and about how it works and about how other pieces of software that use it work. So that interface is very well defined at the Django layer, and they have some really good documentation. That said, that's a broad question, right? The Django admin, like knowing how to use the Django admin panel is not the same as knowing how to use the third-party auth section to be able to integrate Google login for a specific thing. Those are two different things. If you want to understand how the Django admin panel overall, how that's structured and how that results in those things, that's one thing. But the thing that maybe you care more about is that second part, which is like the Django admin for like piece X. How do I know how to use that Django admin well? And that's probably a missing how-to about that specific thing. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. The question was, yeah. So the question here was about whether we are building our own new tool to be able to get the documentation displayed, or if we're using something that exists out of the box. Do you want to take this, or I can? Yeah. So Mark Hober, who wasn't able to come, the sample site was built actually in RST using Sphinx. It doesn't look like the RST using Sphinx because we're just using a different theme, because the sort of the sort of multiple chiclet card look, I think, makes it easier to separate visually and just makes it better for humans to read and like find the thing they need. It's our current thought, right? Like, we think this is easier to read. if other people disagree, we can always change it. But currently, this is Sphinx. We've been talking about if that is the right tool, because Sphinx, you write RST files, you commit them to a repository, they get published. Is that a workflow that works for all of our personas? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm asking because I think this is an excellent kind of opportunity here, because you have just you have all kinds of documentation for different personas, for different use cases, for different levels of usage. So it would be actually excellent if you could kind of do cross referencing throughout documents, right? So as I'm looking at a feature as just how to use it, I also have references. Oh, do you want to customize it? Do you want to do the petition here? So yeah, it's that kind of a thing, but that you're probably not going to find off the shelf.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were able to do something like that. I think Mark did do something like that.
Yeah. I think like in this vein though, I think one of the bigger challenges is that it still requires like some level of basic like experience in GitHub, right? And is that enough of a barrier that we need to explore having like multiple methods or multiple channels for this, or is this just not the right environment for it at all? And I think this is an open question for discussion. Like, what would some of the alternatives be? And maybe this we didn't want to expand the scope of this discovery work, I think, into this because it's too much of a how question. But I think we're there now, and so this is maybe the next step of this discovery work is let's test this assumption that this is the best home for this or not, and let's weigh some of the pros and cons of this, and see what are some alternatives, what could work instead. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Like, what was the assumption of starting with?
So yeah, the question being sort of what are the cons with using something like a Confluence or other wiki product and making it sort of easy to edit be the sort of primary goal. The thing that we lose when we make something easy to edit is the reviewability. A pull request and all of the sort of concepts that a code base has is reviewability is a lot easier. Being able to do sort of checks and making sure that things look nice, we can add like once you can start programming on top of the base document, you can actually start adding more complex things. Sphinx gives us the ability to build that extension. So I didn't catch your name. Sorry. Yes. What was it? Marte? Yeah. So as Marte was saying earlier, like being able to sort of cross-reference in specific ways, or let's say you wanted to build a graph or like some sort of picture into your documentation, you could go build the picture in like some sort of visual editor and then like take a screenshot, put it in there. Okay, now we just added a new box to that thing. You got to go, okay, wait, do I have that file? Okay, maybe I can download it from where I put it. That's a kind of low res version. Do I need to like make a new one now? So like having those assets and having to manage images, videos, other things, like I think we can do using a technology like RST gives us a lot of flexibility on how we write to build something that is engaging for the consumer of the documentation. You can do some of these things with wikis. You can obviously embed videos in wikis. You can obviously do some of them, but like we can do a very specific subset of things that we've imagined in a wiki. And maybe we want a way to have like a keyword system that lets us automatically try to find other documentation for other personas that are talking about the same thing, right? It's like, oh, yes, this is the feature. I found out how to run it. What I need to know is how to turn it on. How do I get from here to the operator documentation? And so that is a complex way of doing it. I think a simple way of doing it is, hey, I'm building the how this feature works and how I use it as an end user. And then I was trying to find the document for how to run it. I couldn't find it. Let me add a link. Like, okay, I eventually found it. Let me add a link it to the page where I think I would like where I wish I had it. Right, updating the documentation and making it be robust is I think really important. That is time. It is really late on the second day of the conference, so I wanted to thank all of you for joining and for some amazing questions. I'm happy to be here and happy to keep talking about this, but I also want to give people who want to leave and breathe fresh air the opportunity to do that. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.